This is my post-fight vid for George Groves versus Badou Jack. First and foremost, full disclosure, I'm ashamed to admit it, I fell asleep last night after the Eddie Hearn card, and not that that put me to sleep at all, but I fell asleep and didn't watch either the George Groves fight or the Floyd Mayweather fight back. I have subsequently watched them. I couldn't find the fights on YouTube, but I was able to find some footage on Daily Motion. The footage I watched of the Floyd Mayweather fight was pretty clear. The George Groves fight wasn't the best stream, so I am not going to talk the ins and outs of this fight for a few reasons. Firstly, I didn't watch it live. Secondly, the stream I watched it on wasn't top quality. Thirdly, everyone who does boxing videos on YouTube has already posted their post-fights to this fight, and unlike myself, they've had the advantage of watching it live. So what I'm going to do is take a slightly different angle here, which is that accepting that George Groves lost this fight, and he lost by a split decision in what was a close fight, where does he go from here? And I think it's time for wholesale change in George Groves' career. Let me say, this is by far the low point of George Groves' career, by far. George Groves is a guy that, he beat, and although I think it's a controversial win, he beat James DeGale, who would rightly be regarded as the top 2 or 3 in the division, and is currently a world champion. George Groves beat James DeGale on the cards. It goes down as a win. He knocked out Paul Smith in 2 rounds, a guy who went 12 rounds twice with Arthur Abraham, who is super middleweight world champion. His 2 defeats come at the hand of Carl Frotz, who's probably a Hall of Famer, a Hall of Famer in terms of his resume. No loss in losing to Carl Frotz, really. Dirrell lost to Frotz, Bute lost to Frotz, Kessler lost to Frotz, Abraham lost to Frotz. Losing to Carl Frotz is no disgrace. But this is the low point of his career. Badou Jack is a likeable fighter. He's a credible opponent. He's a top 10 super middleweight. But Badou Jack, skill-wise, ability-wise, shouldn't be beating George Groves. He shouldn't be. I predicted that George Groves would win this fight by knockout. But if anything, and as I say, the stream that I watched wasn't the best quality, but if anything, it was George Groves who looked like he was the one who'd be more likely to get knocked out. Don't get me wrong, the knockdown in round 1 Groves recovered from, it looked to me to be a sort of one of those shots that affects the equilibrium, affects the balance, not entirely dissimilar to the punch that Dillian Whyte stopped Brian Minto with. Seemed to catch George Groves high on the side of his head and drop him, and he got up. He showed, in my opinion, a bit of inexperience getting up too quickly. And looked on wobbly legs, but anyway, he fought through it. I then saw Groves take a lead in the middle section of the fight. He appeared, after the knockdown had been and gone, he appeared to be the more skilled boxer. He appeared to be first to the punch. He appeared to be the more well-rounded operator. And then, as we all kind of predicted, and as we all kind of suggested before this fight, the stamina problem kicked in. And this is a problem that we've seen time and time again with George Groves. And Badou Jack was able to come on very, very strong. And we know Badou Jack is a high stamina fighter. We know he's got a high work rate. Just look at his performance against Anthony Dirrell. And George Groves looked really, really tired. He looked like he had very little left in the tank. And Badou Jack was able to sweep the early rounds. So, essentially, the 2 reasons George Groves lost this fight: 1, knockdown. The knockdown's key, because that meant it was a 10-8 round. And, when you're dealing with split decisions, I'm not actually 100% sure that had that been a 10-9 round, it would have made the difference. But I think George Groves was winning the first round. So if you were going to give that first round 10-9 to George Groves, but you actually scored it 10-8 to Badou Jack, then in essence, that knockdown represents a 3-round swing. It was going to be +1 for George Groves. It ended up being -2. Yeah? So that knockdown was hugely relevant in the course of the fight. because the fight went to points. Secondarily, the stamina thing was why he lost the fight. So it's the knockdown and the stamina. Now, if you watch my pre-fight video, and if you watch the pre-fight video of any YouTube boxing show out there, I will almost guarantee that 90% of YouTube boxing commentators, analysts, whatever you want to call us, commented on those two issues. The knockdown, or his chin, and his stamina. This is what I don't get about George Groves. George Groves' demise in this fight was predictable. You know, we all thought he'd be the better operator. We all thought that he'd take a lead. We all thought he'd have the chance to dominate the fight early. But it was so predictable that he'd fade. It was so predictable that he might have a defensive frailty and Badou Jack could hurt him. And bearing in mind, Badou Jack, in my opinion, is no grade A puncher. For me, George Groves is in a bit of a rut. His career has gone downhill immensely from leaving Adam Booth. You know, he left Adam Booth just before the first Carl Frost fight. And at that time, he was a guy who'd beaten James DeGale, who'd beaten Paul Smith, who arguably was getting the better of Carl Frost. Since then, he's been knocked out cold by Frost. He's laboured to unimpressive victories over Rebrasse and Dennis Douglin. And he's lost to Badou Jack. In fact, I think it's fair to say that since he's left Adam Booth, he's actually had 3 losses and 2 wins. And the 2 wins were to guys well outside of the top 10. Well outside of the top 10. So for me, that was a big mistake from George Groves. The move away from Adam Booth simply has not worked. And what I don't get is the lack of evolution in his game. The lack of adaptation. You know, this is what I often think. If you were in a fight in a pub, and I'm talking basic here, if you were in a fight in a pub or someone tried to rob you in the street or something like that, and you got into a fight situation, and you were persistently getting hit with the same punch, wouldn't you think to put your hands up, you know, in the area you're consistently getting punched? I mean, this is basic level stuff. And yet I'm not seeing any defensive adaptation from George Groves. What are they working on in camp? That after all the stamina questions and queries and issues that have been raised by all and sundry, after all of those stamina comments, they come into the fight and the stamina is clearly starting to sap round 7, round 8. For me, we need to make some, basic changes to the roots of his game. First and foremost, I think he needs to swallow his pride and go back to Adam Booth. And even if Booth won't have him back, he needs to go back to some sort of trainer, because it's not working for him at present. Paddy Fitzpatrick, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but this guy isn't an elite level trainer. He's got no history of winning world title fights. Secondly, for George Groves, and I think this is absolutely key, is I honestly think he needs to move weight class. Groves is a guy now in his mid to late 20s. He's no younger the young boy that we've all thought of him as for several years now. He's a proper man. He should be in the peak of his career. And for me, he's simply too big for super middleweight. He's too big. If you look at him next to Carl Frost, if you look at him next to James DeGale now, and I think last night at times, if you looked at him next to Badou Jack, George Groves is very, very big at the weight. And when your two problems are stamina and punch resistance, on occasion, those two issues can be directly linked to cutting substantial amounts of weight. Now, if George Groves, and I appreciate the water at 175 is quite deep, and I appreciate for someone like George Groves, who might have a chin problem, fighting guys like Sergei Kovalev, fighting guys like Adonis Stevenson, who are massive power punchers at the weight above, may not sound like a sensible option. And I get that. But if George Groves can have improved punch resistance due to not having to cut weight, which is certainly a possibility, and if his stamina doesn't leave him so early because he's not so drained from the weight cutting exercise, then potentially we've got a different fighter on our hands. the fighter who fought Carl Frost and Carl Frost won was so elusive, was so explosive, was so dynamic, was so dangerous, you know. He could live with those guys. The issue there was that he got hurt and he ran out of stamina. Now if he could bring that momentum but have slightly higher punch resistance and not be so drained, there's scope for him to still make waves. But right now, I can't see how he makes waves at 168. The James DeGale rematch, I mean, in hindsight, what a disaster that was from George Groves not to take that rematch at Wembley with Eddie Hearn. I mean, you know, he's a million miles off that rematch now. That was a really poor decision from Groves. But that rematch, I don't see how George Groves has a chance. You know, James DeGale would surely hurt George Groves with DeGale's improvement in power punching. James DeGale would surely, you know, he's been in 12-round championship fights with Andre Durrell. I know he looked low stamina at times in that fight himself, but not to the same extent as George Groves. Surely he'd back DeGale to win the later rounds. I mean, Groves' career is in trouble, and I don't see how he can recover unless he addresses the basic, obvious problems: punch resistance, stamina, trainer. For me, George Groves re-signing with Adam Booth, moving up to £175, creates an interesting question that could go either way. He could get absolutely flattened at 175, it's a possibility. But he at least poses an interesting question at that weight class. Whereas for me, George Groves at 168, he's no longer top level. He's a step below world class. He's a guy who gets dragged into the trenches by Christopher Abrace. Just my thoughts. But I think George Groves in his current form is finished. And I think he can only come back and only cut the mustard at an elite level if George Groves in his current form ceases to exist. And if he completely reinvents himself, reinvents his tactics and reinvents his game. I think needs to be a big change up in strategy, change in weight class, and a big change up in personnel. A return to Adam Booth makes him an interesting fighter. A step up in weight does. Seeing what we've seen in his last 3 or 4 fights, that super middle, it's just not there at the elite level. Let me know your thoughts. Many thanks for watching this video.